Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today, this evening, this morning, wherever you are in the world. I am Sharon Moshavi. I am the president of ICFJ, the International Center for Journalists, and welcome to the ICFJ Pamela Howard Forum on Global Crisis Reporting. This is our inaugural event. We're still going to be covering developments on the COVID-19 pandemic, which, as we know, has not ended yet. But just as every reporter became a health reporter during the pandemic, the global challenges ahead really mean that journalists need to build expertise uncovering future crises of importance to their local audiences. So we're expanding our programming to bring you a series of events and access to experts, veteran reporters, trainings on urgent topics of the day, be it disinformation, rising authoritarianism, tech disruption, and much more. Today, we are going to kick off with climate change in our new forum, and we are very honored to name this initiative after our longtime ICFJ Vice Chair, Pamela Howard, who has been a really amazing, staunch, and dedicated supporter of our work for over 20 years. So today, we bring you a really fantastic group of climate change reporters, and I want to introduce them all to you, and then we will go right to it. We have Yessenia, who is climate director at Atmos, Steve Mufson, who is at the Washington Post covering the business of climate change. We've got Eric Roston, who is climate reporter at Bloomberg Green, and Lauren Sommer, who covers climate change for NPR's Science Desk. So thanks all of you. Thanks very much for joining us today. Much appreciated. And I know the journalists in our network appreciate it as well. So I want to kick off the discussion by talking about words. Words matter. And I want to talk about climate change, climate crisis, climate emergency. What terms should we be using and why? And why does terminology matter in reporting on this issue? Who wants to kick us off?
I can start. Maybe also just a little bit of historical background. Climatic change is a scientific sounding and really a scientific phrase. There's a journal named Climatic Change, and I think that's probably one of the older and more neutral iteration. And some of our reporting just in the last year or two bears that out. Global warming was coined, the phrase itself, by a Columbia University scientist named Wallace Broecker in 1975. I think the mundane answer for me is I often use them interchangeably. It's just nice to have two phrases that mean one thing for the most part. There are differences. Global warming is specifically related to heat. Climate change encompasses the many other knock-on effects that result from the warming.
Anyone else have any thoughts on that? And is there any danger to any of these terms or any problems that any of them create?
Well, we at Atmos sort of follow the leadership that The Guardian put forth when they changed their language in covering climate change, where we often use climate crisis, climate emergency. We do use these terms in our reporting and in our writing, but we still do use climate change. Actually, the one term that we're now shying away from using is global warming, and more so using global heating to sort of underscore the intensity of what the planet is experiencing and what communities are experiencing. Obviously, we're a magazine, and so we sort of have a slant that newspapers such as the Post may not. And our readers, I think, really appreciate sort of the urgency that we communicate through our writing. Sorry, my cat's joining us here.
Hey, it's Zoom.
Exactly. But yeah, we've sort of erred on the side of communicating that urgency and using language that might connect with readers a little more.
Yeah, and we are using the phrase climate change. Partly because, as Eric was saying, global warming doesn't quite do it. It's about one aspect of climate change. At the same time, we haven't opted for climate crisis, at least not yet, for a lot of reasons. But I think for now, we're sticking with climate change.
Can I ask what some of those reasons are?
On the climate crisis, well, I think that you don't, we haven't actually sat down and had a meeting about this, but my own feeling is that climate crisis, you tend to drive away some of our readers who we would like to stick around to actually learn the details of what we're talking about. And I think that's important in its own way.
I would just add too that, for the average reader or listener, the words climate change probably mean something slightly different to everybody. And so specificity is really something I think about a lot, which is should I just say climate change, or should I say rising sea levels or extreme heat waves or whatever the impact is? The tangible detail is always going to be stronger, in my opinion, to let people know what we're talking about instead of them inferring it.
That's great. That makes me think about sort of one of the challenges of covering this story. And one of it is it's a long unfolding story, right? It's a slow story in some ways, if you will. It's urgent, but it's not a new crisis that we're facing or a new issue. So how do you deal with that and deal with it along the lines at the same time, the way Steve pointed out, which is you don't want to drive away audiences. You want them, it's urgent, but again, how do you deal with this? How do you get people engaged with this sort of long tail of a story?
Well, and the question is, if it's urgent, how long can you keep saying it's urgent? So, I mean, we know amongst ourselves, I think we know it could be quite a long time, but I think, that's another reason to take things one giant step at a time.
Anyone else have any thoughts on that?
I think.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Lauren.
No, I was going to say, doing audio storytelling, we really start with people. We talk with, voices and personal stories. And there's, as every climate reporter knows, there's no shortage of people that are making really hard decisions, going through really tough things, because then climate change is making it all worse every single day. So I think for me, I'm always thinking about who's the person we're connecting to in this story to really help us understand the stakes. Because as we all know, there's a lot of numbers, there's a lot of big policies, there's a lot of economics, there's a lot of really tough things that are barriers a lot of times to really engaging with this story. So I'm always asking, what's the personal story that's going to draw somebody in?
I also think, and it's maybe a minority opinion, but science is just interesting. And, obviously that's coming from the science reporter, but I've been, just kind of pleasantly surprised over the years that there does seem to be an appetite for just kind of the basics of climate change. There does not seem to be a diminishing interest in how do we know it's warming and how do we know what's going to happen, and a lot of the basic questions. And you can tell good stories in audio, in visual, in print, that communicate those basics in a way that is just, that's just the facts, but provide the context that is tough to put into, every story.
So you raised two issues or two elements of what makes a good story and a good climate story is voices, the impacts on real people, as Lauren said. What you just talked about, people like science, they kind of like that. What else do you need to actually really create a story that speaks to people and goes beyond maybe the bubble of people who are are de facto interested in the subject? I'm going to turn to Steve on that one.
Well, this isn't a sexy answer, but one thing you need is people who are knowledgeable on economics and business, and the amount of money that is going to be required to make this transition to a different type of economy is just mind-blowing. And yet, there are some knowledgeable and respected people who are willing to explain all that. And I think that's an important way to reach readers and an important fact for us all to be thinking about. For example, the president's target of cutting emissions by 52%. Well, what does that mean in terms of dollars? And is it even? I mean, and when you think about that, you you might think, well, gosh, maybe this isn't doable, or maybe we need to be doing more, or maybe we need to be doing something quickly. But whatever it is, I think, understanding just how much is at stake and how much it has cost over the last century to build the kind of energy infrastructure that now we're basically, largely throw overboard.
Yessenia,
I might
go ahead, Eric.
provide another view is, the whole world, every country invests in everything, all its infrastructure all the time. And there's a lot of people whose research have found that it's not that much. I mean, when you look at what we invest anyway, and I think one of the very interesting things I wanted to point out at some point in the call is just the library of material generated over the last 20 years by researchers and policy analysts who have put forward pretty specific roadmaps of what needs to change and how much it will cost. I don't want to talk too much here, but just like two of my takeaways from this was we know what's happening and we know what to do. Steve's right, like the people who have to foot that bill, it's a big bill. But I don't see not knowing what to do or prohibitive cost compared to not spending that money as a prohibitive factor in solving the problem.
Yeah, and you know what all of this discussion around like money and cost reminds me of is the money that we're spending already, right, on extreme weather impacts, the rebuilding, the constant rebuilding, and of course the long-term like health ramifications of all that's already happening and what's going to continue to happen. And I think that, pulling out some of those stories of those impacts, both through the numbers and the facts, right, of the finances, but also reminding readers of, the people today who are experiencing these impacts and whose entire lives are devastated because of it is a really crucial part of the story. And all of us here on the call, I think all of our desks do an incredible job of really telling those stories and stepping away beyond just the numbers and the facts and really trying to tug at people's heartstrings, because unfortunately, while leaders are delaying some of the steps to get dollars rolling for the just transition, they're actively spending taxpayer dollars on the rebuilding post disasters, and we're seeing this happening at a rapid rate. Right, there's just no time to rebuild before the next disaster strikes, and I think that that's a big part of the story too, is how we're, as a nation, being a little irresponsible with our current spending, and I don't think that gets enough attention as well in the sort of like financial space.
I mean, I would just say partly response to Eric that yes, we do know how to do these things, and the money in some ways is around, but we aren't doing things fast enough. I mean, and at scale, speed and scale, those are the things that are going to kill us. I mean, the actual technology is not going to be the problem in the long run. And I think that's an important element.
So it's interesting listening to all of you, because you're talking about solutions, right? What do we do to solve the problem? To Eric's point, we know there's a roadmap. How do you see your role as journalists? Is your role to put out solutions to help change things? Because I'm not hearing a just the facts, ma'am, kind of attitude, which is interesting, and so I'm just really curious about how you see your role and the role of journalists in covering an issue like this that obviously has very political overtones, shall we say?
Well, I'm happy to give that a shot. So, I mean, I think that when you're a journalist, you're always prioritizing things. You're prioritizing your facts, your story selection, where something appears in the story, how you describe it, and what you choose to leave out. And so I think what you're seeing is, to some extent, a story selection and a selection of things that illustrate aspects of climate change because we've chosen to write about climate change and think that that's important. So I think that's partly what you're seeing.
I would say, as much as this story is about, what the major emitting countries are doing policy-wise, it really is a local story in terms of whether your house is going to burn down or be flooded. It's local decisions that really matter. And a lot of communities are trying to tackle this, or trying to change their built environment or protect themselves from sea level rise or whatever it is. And everyone's kind of doing it on their own pace and with the amount of money they have or don't have. And so that, I think, it's not necessarily, it's a solution story in the sense of, like, part of the job for us is figuring out, well, who's doing this well, and who's protecting people, and at what cost, and how can they, who's falling behind, who's being left behind. And so that's because of this, the built environment is just so localized. That's really part of the story as well.
I think one answer to that question that sort of piggybacks off of Lauren's comment could be an answer on any panel of this sort on any topic, and that's oversight. And as climate change, the energy transformation have emerged as a major topic in every country, keeping an eye on who's making decisions and who's spending money and where that money is coming from to influence those decisions, all that basic journalism 101 stuff. Now that climate change has reached this scale, that stuff applies, and we can't forget the basics of oversight.
Do you find that there are, as you're doing your work, that there are any misconceptions about climate reporting, even either by other journalists in your newsroom or elsewhere, or by your audience or your sources?
I certainly think so. I mean, I know that even myself, when I, decided I wanted to become an environmental reporter, there's this idea that you need to be, a science geek and a nerd, and that you need to know all the ins and outs of, ecology and biology, atmospheric sciences and meteorology. And I think that can be farther from the truth. It really depends on the kind of climate reporting you want to do. I mean, obviously, it's important to know the basics of climate change. That's integral to doing proper climate reporting. But I think that any reporter can jump into this beat and figure out how to tell a climate story without having, the educational technical background of climate science. And, while I'm at Atmos as a climate director, I also do a lot of work with the Uproot Project, which is a network by and for environmental journalists of color. And that's something we hear from many of our members is, I didn't think that I could be an environmental reporter because I didn't go to school to study this stuff. And it's something that we tell many of our members is, it's just like picking up any other beat, and you're a reporter, right? And reporters, we're great at learning new information and learning it quick and then communicating it effectively to an audience. And that's just like any other beat. That's how you can jump into climate reporting. And I think that that's a big misconception that, I think intimidates people to get into this space. And I encourage folks to I guess, get rid of that misconception, because it's really important that more reporters and more editors and more desks in general are covering this topic.
My favorite answers to that question historically is that there's something about climate and environmental journalism that people assume when they hear you're doing it, that they confuse you with being an activist in a way that would not apply to any other field of journalistic endeavor. Like, no one has ever asked a politics editor, "Oh, you're the politics editor. What office are you running for?" Or, no one has ever asked a cancer science reporter when they were diagnosed and what kind they have. But somehow with climate change and environmental journalists, people assume all kinds of things about you personally that I've always found sort of amusing.
Interesting.
But I think people are, if you cover a storm or a flood or a fire or anything, any major event in the place where you are already a climate reporter. It's just, you may not be folding that stuff in as much as you think you are.
Well, and I'll just say, that, you can, like Yessenia was just saying, you can learn anything quickly. I mean, that's your most important asset as a reporter. And, I've covered China, foreign policy, the White House, economic policy, energy. So, it's all, I like to say it's like serial graduate school.
So that being said, anybody can be a climate reporter. Are there common mistakes that you do see happening in the news media? Is there any constructive criticism that you could provide about the type of reporting that you're seeing, and in how it's framed or data, what have you? Any thoughts about that?
As someone who covers climate justice and environmental justice in particular, which looks at the impacts to communities of color, low-income communities, and also the ways that communities of color and low-income communities are responding to the crisis, I think that there is still way too much trust in institutions and in what officials say versus the distrust that reporters give to community members. While the Flint water crisis wasn't like a climate change story, it was a story of environmental racism. And I always come back to that because the media really feel that community immeasurably, right? I mean, folks were talking about the water being contaminated for a good year before national media outlets began to take them seriously, and only because state and local officials kept telling them, no, it's fine. And I think that sentiment carries through in journalism within the climate space. Whereas, if ExxonMobil says they're going to be climate neutral by 2050, I think a lot of folks just sort of take that for what it is versus questioning what that means and hearing from the communities who are actively working to, in some cases, abolish some of these companies and what these companies are doing to their communities locally. So I think that we as journalists need to be critical of what institutions we choose to believe in our reporting. And I think that there needs to be more trust in the communities who are experts on their own, of their own communities and of their experiences.
I think, okay. I was going to say we toss around numbers a lot, and I'm sure I'm guilty of this. We say 1.5 degrees Celsius, as a Paris Agreement, blah, blah. I'm always trying to think about, like, right next to that sentence, am I saying what happens if we exceed 1.5? Just like a couple little things, because that doesn't mean much to people, right? 1.5 C, what is that? And we use that all the time. So I think I'm always trying to be aware of how I'm putting things into context for people. And then, I think we mentioned the cost stuff, which I think is huge. The numbers, the short-term numbers need to go with the long-term numbers, right? The cost of inaction, like those numbers need to be next to each other all the time in stories. So people can kind of, get the sense that, like, in a lot of cases, the short-term spending is actually a pretty good deal.
I think one theme that has already come up is how everybody's a climate journalist now. But I think sometimes that only means adding a dependent clause to a story or a short paragraph to a story, providing a sentence of context. The American media in general has made great strides on moving away from the sort of both sidesism, like, just kind of he said, she said, journalism on climate. But the fact is both sides, whatever sides you're talking about, are both subordinate to sort of physical reality. And making sure you have the top line facts, nothing complicated about climate change at your fingertips, just have it ready. So if you need to quote a politician who's incorrect, you can correct them before you present their quote. That kind of context, I think, really helps.
That makes sense. Context was a word you all used in talking about this, which brings me to actually thinking about this as a global issue, right? We know that climate change, the ultimate cross-border issue. How much does that inform your reporting, American media's reporting, do you think, on climate change? And where can and should journalists do better in looking at this as a global story, but still bringing it home to their local audiences?
Well, I mean, I actually think the quality of reporting on climate change has been great and coming from a lot of different places. So it's hard for me to say that I would do something better. I think we need to do more, but that's just the question of how much you can deal with on your plate. I mean, I think as far as overseas and what one might do on overseas stories, that's something, we could probably do more of, and I think people are going to be doing more. At the Post, as a lot of you probably know, we a couple of years ago did a series on whose theme was basically climate change is here and it's at your doorstep. And it's hard to imagine that was only 2 years ago, because that's become such a sort of point. Whereas we had a lot of success, and we had a lot of success by bringing it to people. So we had stories about how the fastest warming states in the lower 48 were Rhode Island and New Jersey. I think most people in New Jersey hadn't really thought about that. And we went overseas and did stories overseas in about 8 different places. And of course, you could just keep going like that, not limited at 8, because this is such a global issue. So I think bringing the story to people and to things that they can recognize or imagine was important. The piece I did was about Qatar and about how they were trying to air condition a lot of outdoor areas, getting ready for the soccer tournament that they had agreed to host. So, that sort of thing, I think, I can't tell you how many people, came up to me, and said, God, they're air conditioning the outdoors. So I think things like that can touch people, I think, are helpful ways to tell stories.
Anyone else have a thought on that?
Yeah, I mean, we at Atmos do a lot of international stories, especially for our print magazine. We often work with photographers and writers and other continents, from stories, in African Sahara to stories in Indian jungle. And it's a big part of our storytelling approach, because we recognize that many of these impacts are being felt by communities in these places. But as someone who tries to focus my reporting specifically on the US, because it's where I'm based and it feels most natural to me, when I do international reporting, I do try my hardest to bring it home and try to make the connections to the US. Most of our audience is based in the US. I did a reporting trip last year where I went out to Nicaragua to visit some of the indigenous mosquito communities who had been impacted by hurricanes Eta and Iota. And, it could have been a straightforward, post-disaster story, but I dug a little deeper and realized that many of these indigenous people were migrating out of their communities. They're super remote communities. They're making a pretty dramatic change because of how devastated they were left. And the story's not out yet, but it's essentially a story of, immigration. And I think that immigration in particular is such a big theme within climate reporting that's going to become an even more bigger story than it already has been, not just for the US, but abroad as well, whether that's internal displacement or external displacement. I mean, we're seeing migration even within the US now, but we're going to be seeing even more migration from other countries. And I think that that's a really powerful theme within climate reporting that that just holds a lot of potential for powerful stories that I think are going undertold, beyond just the sort of stereotypical migration story of Central America. I think that often gets told a lot in the US. There's just so many more layers that aren't being explored there from other regions and specific communities within even Central America, such as the indigenous peoples of Central America. So I think that international reporting, even for US-based outlets, is going to play a big role in the future of climate storytelling. And I think that there's going to be a lot more outlets probably coming out with a focus on that.
Also,
sorry, go ahead, Eric.
Well, just briefly, globalism is built into this topic in a unique way. 195 nations have been meeting and discussing this every December for 25 years. Not only is it one-stop shopping for sources and trying to find stories to tell about places you can never go to, but it's just like a 195-side chess game. Where it's well, why is Norway sending money to Brazil to protect forests? There's just all kinds of bilateral and multilateral intrigues and coalitions that make it a very interesting geopolitical strategy story. In addition to just the physical fact that Brazil's forests are important for everybody and not just Brazil. So there's a lot of a unique intersection of geopolitics and planetary systems.
That's great. I want to drill down into those. I'm just going to ask a couple of more questions, then we'll turn to questions people are already posting in the chat. But a reminder, if you do have a question, just post it in the chat. We'll get there in a couple of minutes. I wanted to go to something, Yessenia, you just talked about, which is the theme of migration, and there are themes. So obviously, lots going on under the climate change banner, lots of impacts and stories. I'm curious for all of you, what, this coming year, 2022, in the next 12 to 18 months, what are the themes, the most important themes around this issue that you see being dominant? Lauren, do you want to start?
Let's see. I think, obviously there'll be another COP conference coming in November. It's in Egypt this year. The issues of climate finance and loss and damage, these kind of the debate that started last fall about whether, the heaviest emitters should be providing loss and damage funds for countries that are really experiencing the impacts, how climate finance is being spent and where it's being spent. I mean, that is obviously an ongoing debate, but I think one that's going to be extremely important at the next COP, of course. And, that's a huge equity and climate justice issue as well. A lot of stories there. I think one that I always keep an eye on is, as much as we have really good data and information about kind of what's going to happen with climate change, what the trends are, what's already happening, the effects that we're seeing, it's still challenging for communities, whether it's states or cities or countries, to integrate that information to the decisions they make every day, right? About where they spend their money, how they spend their money, where people are building their houses, what needs to be changed about infrastructure, how is their energy system evolving? I think that is a really tough thing where if you're a community that's already under-resourced and facing a huge amount of challenges, it's an added layer to say, what are things going to look like in 30 years? And how does that change our spending or our decisions that we make now? So getting that science and that planning, kind of into local communities and kind of their goals and what they're doing, I think it's just a huge issue everywhere. And there's a lot of stories there.
I'm really fascinated with these two themes around, I think firstly the private sector, and I think that we're seeing a lot of momentum and pressure on the private sector to begin taking the climate crisis more seriously. New York State just introduced a bill to regulate, clothing and apparel and footwear companies, which would be major and have like global ramifications, right? Like what they do abroad will directly impact whether New York State will essentially welcome them to do business in the state. And so I think that we're going to see more pressure on private companies, and it's really exciting, I think, moment to be covering the private sector, whether someone's reporting on the oil and gas industry, or whether someone's a fashion reporter or an auto reporter, someone who reports on cars. There's just so much innovation and also I think openness that we hadn't seen from the private sector before. I think the other theme for me that just leaves me really alarmed is sort of access to democracy. And this is, one in the US, it's been a pretty big deal. It's an election year this year. We saw the insurrection last year. And, for folks who are really connected to climate policy, it's clear that democracy is an essential foundation to achieving any sort of forward action on climate policy. And, while we all in the US think a lot about the US in particular, there's some concerning patterns globally on, right-leaning and really white supremacist types having more power, dictatorships in Central America, seizing power. And all of this has impacts for whether countries move forward on reducing the greenhouse gas emissions. And so that, for me, I think is a big theme that is alarming. And I don't think that there's enough connections between, this rise in white supremacy and dictatorship and fascism and then the sort of delay in climate action. And I think that depending on how elections here in the US, but also abroad, I believe Brazil's election is this year as well. Depending on how these elections go, that's going to dictate a lot of what happens in the next decade. So I think that that's a big story that we need to all be covering and watching this more closely.
Yeah, I noted with interest, Sharon, the list of other seminars that that are being offered on technology and on democracy and climate. It's all just one big mess at some point, and these mega topics are all bumping into each other. I put this quote out. I think about this quote every day. It's from Heather McGhee, who's board chair of the group Color of Change. She's a prominent political commentator. She said several years ago, inequality and climate change are the twin challenges of our time, and more democracy is the answer to both. I thought that was a really, really succinct and powerful way to sort of, wrap three very big things: climate change, inequality, and democracy, all into one statement. And so I think, what am I doing this year? Well, I'm trying to look for stories that sort of fit that statement.
That's interesting. Well, let's go to some questions in the chat. We've got a number of questions there. Some we've touched on a bit, but I think we want to go back to some of these. One question from Chidera, a health journalist in Nigeria, asks, I think this is relevant to what you just said, Eric, is how do we simplify climate change conversations for our audience? These are massive issues. There's a lot of data we talk about, there's a lot of numbers, and these are mega issues that are, as you said, bumping into each other. So how do you simplify that conversation? Is simplify even the right word for audiences?
I don't want to sound glib, but I think you just simplify it. It's like part of our job as journalists is to make things simpler. And I mean, I think that I think it's simpler than we've been led to believe. I think all of the disinformation that's been going on for 20 or 30 years, has succeeded in convincing people that this is a complex topic. It's like, things fall when you drop them, and eyesight works, and heat trapping gases trap heat. I think demystifying and sort of pushing back at the idea that this is a complicated topic when, we understand and have modeled climate change far better than gravity or eyesight or a lot of other things we just take for granted. It's like, if you turn up the thermostat, it will get hotter. There is one number that matters. It's the amount we emit every year. And if that goes down, the thermostat will go down.
I think always, for radio, I think about this a lot, right? There's a lot that maybe in print you would be okay with in a quote. When you hear it on the radio, it makes absolutely no sense, and you can't go back and listen to it again. And so make sure your sources are helping you. If they're using jargon, stop them and make them do it again. And sometimes it involves being a little bit pushy, but just say, the average person is not going to understand that word. Do you mind doing that again? And just kind of explain it in more basic terms. Just make them do it over.
Well, and I think where you're not explaining things like that, you want to be able to show things. So you want to show something that might not have been associated with climate change, but is, and you're going to tell how. But finding that thing that you're describing is an important part.
There's a question here we kind of touched on before, but I want to go back to a little bit. It's from Sandra and Lima, who said, right now we're facing the biggest sea oil spill in our country's history, 6,000 barrels of oil spilled. Where do you draw the line on being an activist from doing your job as a journalist?
The speed with which we're all jumping into answering that question leads me to believe that it's really touched a nerve. There's no doubt that there's a difference between activism and journalism, where it changes over time. All of us for many years now have said things and written things we could never have said in the decade or two before. Is it right for me to say that, quote Heather McGhee, by saying that, inequality and climate change are the twin challenges of our time and more democracy is the answer to both? Is that advocacy? Is that journalism? It's transparent. It's what I think. It's framing my work. An interesting thing is, if people are going to be harmed and we can avoid death and suffering, like, is that an automatic? Can we automatically advocate for elimination of suffering? I don't know. Sometimes it seems like we can't, and that seems ridiculous. I don't know. I think awareness of the question and the circumstances of your employment and or the conditions, you know, where you're publishing, those are all important criteria to keep in mind. But also, I think widely accepted beliefs of right and wrong in your society are worth keeping in mind, and not, don't avoid the obvious, I guess.
Steve, you unmuted.
Well, I think that you know, because there is so much evidence about this phenomenon, that to some extent you're not an activist just by describing things and pointing out things. And I think some journalists are overly worried about this. I think back to when I worked at the Wall Street Journal, and we often wrote stories at the Journal, which were very pointed, but I like to think of it as to the point. And they were stories about things that you wouldn't read on the Wall Street Journal editorial page, of course, but you would read in the news columns. And a lot of people at other newspapers shied away from that, and thinking that that was somehow too biased, when it wasn't. And I think we've come to sort of belatedly to that point on climate change. The evidence is clear, or a lot of evidence is clear. Tremendous, maybe not on tornadoes. I mean, that's maybe a good example of something where you don't necessarily want to jump out in front of it, because if it turns out to be true, it undermines your credibility on other things. But there are so many other things to be credible about. And I guess I don't see this as that difficult a problem, really.
Yeah, just to echo, I mean, a health reporter doesn't get questioned about why a cancer cure article is important. The data is absolutely there, and that's what we're reporting on. You know, it's death, it's human suffering, it's displacement, it's economic losses. Like, the information is there, and it's not really a question of advocacy in my mind.
I do think you have to be careful sometimes. You know, you're in casual conversation with someone and you might say something in a way that you wouldn't want to see in the newspaper. And so that's important to keep in mind. You need to preserve your credibility. That's the important thing. And that's what's important about the role of journalists. You need to be credible. So I think that's something you just need to remind yourself about every once in a while.
Yeah, and I guess I just want to add, you know, while I agree with everything everyone said so far, I do think that some of these concerns, like I can really empathize with some of these concerns, just because I think of, you know, during the Black Lives Matter uprising of 2020, in many newsrooms, Black reporters weren't allowed to report on that, right? Because they were seen as biased simply by way of being Black, and the inherent belief that you're going to be biased about this because you're a Black person. And I think that there is some truth to the concerns that folks have here around how they'll be treated, you know, by future colleagues, but if they're covering a certain issue, and of course, depending on the types of stories they choose to cover. You know, I've covered racial justice alongside climate justice, and I know for a fact, like I highly doubt I would get hired by certain newsrooms at this point in my career because of my specific lens on an issue and because of how I've chosen to cover the issue. But I think that you as a journalist need to decide what kind of a journalist you want to be. I think that there is sort of a new wave of journalism that is more welcoming to, you know, being pointed, I think, as Steve said, and that really welcomes, you know, opinion sprinkled in a reported piece. And many magazines in particular are quite embracing, I think, this way of reporting. And so I think as a journalist, you need to be intentional about what kind of a journalist you want to be, right? I pride myself in being an outspoken journalist who isn't afraid of, you know, tweeting something that might offend someone else or make someone think that I'm an activist, because I don't consider myself an activist. I consider myself a journalist. But I know for some editors and some newsrooms, they may consider me an activist, right? And so I think it's about deciding who do you want to be and what are you comfortable with people perceiving you as, and sort of accepting what the consequences of that may be.
This leads to, there's a question here about basically, climate deniers, and how do you, as a journalist, and maybe you've already answered this to some extent, but address the climate change deniers, the vast amounts of mis and disinformation that come out. I mean, where do you see your role in dealing with this phenomenon, shall we say?
Well, I'm not crazy about the term climate deniers because it has a kind of religious overtone to me. You're a denier. Yeah, you deny things that are questions of faith, and this is not a question of faith. This is a question of facts, and I think it's important to write about people who you might call climate deniers, but I would just say that I try at least not to use that, but to point out what the facts are in those circumstances.
And are you actively looking at all for dis or misinformation, or seeing what is bubbling up, let's say, and trying to approach that or attack that head on or sideways?
It depends what the story is about. So if when I did a story about whether or not the Republicans in Congress were starting to clue into the climate issue, then yes, they definitely want to take it head on there. And there are other things when it may be less crucial. I think you don't want, what is important not to let slide by is if there's an assertion that's just not true, then that you need to point out that it's not true right there on the spot, even if it's not the main point of your story. But do it quickly, maybe.
And kind of a newer territory that I think a lot of people are kind of grappling with is not necessarily that the people are saying, well, climate change doesn't exist. It's just the rate of change that needs to happen and how fast it needs to happen. So that people may not be saying, well, it's not a problem, but that, the urgency for them isn't there, or is almost completely not there. But that seems to be maybe the new territory of where the fact checking kind of needs to happen, right? Is maybe like the pace of the change and what's actually happening.
One of the most useful things to ever occur in this space, at least for journalists, was the 2018 report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, analyzing what's the difference between a world that warms an average of 1.5 degrees Celsius versus one that warms 2 degrees of Celsius. And their analysis led to the conclusion that in order to avoid more than 1.5 degrees of warming, we need to eliminate the impact of greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 and have that by 2030. And that's a tall order, but it's based in empiricism, and any interview virtually on any subject about climate change can be brought back to how are you doing compared to the 2030 goal? How are you doing compared to the 2050 goal? And one of the most remarkable things I've seen, and I've been doing this, a long time, is the speed with which this idea of net zero and 2030, 2050 temperature targets have just conquered the world. And now we're in this phase where we're just trying to wade through all the greenwashing and sort of weak statements people are saying to try to make it seem like they're complying with this. But unfortunately, we're at a phase where the science itself has made it very easy, or at least easier, to ask single questions that reveal whether someone is taking this seriously or not.
Thanks, Eric. There are a few questions in here about sort of resources, tools, websites. Where can people go to basically kind of, cover climate change 101 perhaps, or get started? If you were going to sort of pick a few resources, one or something, you mentioned something right now, Eric, what would those be? And as a caveat to that is, you know, a lot of countries, some people watching here, there is not publicly available data. So where are places that people could get data on their own countries that they might not be able to get from their local sources?
In anticipation of this question, I created a list before we started.
Oh, fantastic. You know what? Well, we will share. You want to talk through it really quick, but we can tell everybody, we will share it out to everybody. So we don't necessarily have to.
And this is incomplete, and everyone on this call can generate lists at least as long as this. But the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, NASA, the U.S. National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, climate.gov, climate.nasa.gov, the UK Royal Society, the US Global Change Research Program, and the US National Climate Assessments, the UK Met Office, the US National Academy of Sciences, the UK Climate Change Committee, the World Health Organization, the International Energy Agency, the World Bank, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the American Geophysical Union, the World Resources Institute, Union of Concerned Scientists Disinformation Library, skepticalscience.com, and the list goes on.
Okay, well, what I will let everybody else do, because we're running close to time here. I want to get to a couple more questions. Is, if you don't mind, we can share it. We'll share these links at the rest of you. If you've got anything, send it to us as well, and we'll compile everything for folks. That's great. That's very helpful. Thank you for being prepared, Eric. There's a few questions here about investigative reporting around climate change. What appetite are you seeing for that? What stories do you think have been done that have had great impact, and what topics of investigation really do you see that really need to be addressed? Sort of a big question, but feel free to take a piece of that.
I think that what I would, if I had like the investigative resources to do like my dream investigation of sorts, I think that the deaths of environmental land defenders globally require some serious investigation. Environmental land defenders are some of the most at-risk populations in the world. We're seeing an increase in annually how many are killed every year, with Colombia being one of the most dangerous countries for environmental activists. And with the growing rise and urgency to protect forests and protect carbon sinks, the work that they're doing is quite critical, especially for some of the indigenous communities. That research has shown actually do a better job of protecting these natural resources than non-indigenous communities. And I think that there's a lot of questions around who's ordering these killings, what are governments doing to prevent these killings? Are governments involved in these killings? These are a lot of questions that advocates on the ground have, and many people do believe that, in fact, governments and private companies are the ones ordering these killings. And there's been very little, I think, investigative reporting on this. Bloomberg did do some really powerful reporting on the murder of Berta Cáceres. I'm not sure, Eric, if you're involved in that, but I was in love with that story. I thought it was really well done. And I think that's exactly the type of investigative reporting that we need more of, because this is a crisis. It's a human rights crisis. And it's really alarming. I just saw news today about a 14-year-old in Colombia who was just killed out doing like a, what is it called? They sort of go out onto the land to see if there are any loggers or assailants on their territories. And yeah, he was shot dead. He and I believe 2 others. So, this is a severe crisis that I don't think we'll have any solutions until investigative reporters really start digging into some of this.
My colleagues at Bloomberg Green have reported on forced labor in Western China and the solar panel industry. They recently did a big investigation into MSCI, the big financial data company that creates indexes, and looked at how they're defining ESG and whether it's actually good for anybody other than MSCI. Other colleagues have looked at the validity of forest offsets in different part of the world. They're, again, back to the question of oversight. I think you start asking basic oversight questions about this space, and you'll find stories, regardless of what the specific topic is. I'm dying to hear Steve's answer to the question, as his team is the only media organization, I think, in the world that's ever won a Pulitzer Prize for the kind of stories that answer that question.
Well, I was actually going to say how much I admire your story list, and it is closer to the kind of reporting that we're doing at the Post. The piece, the group that we won the Pulitzer Prize for was actually not an investigative; it was an explainer. Although, you know, it has a kind of gotcha element to it, partly by analyzing data. We crunched a lot of numbers for that series and found things that, you know, other scientists weren't really paying attention to, such as, you know, what percentage of the world was living in a place that had already gone beyond 2 degrees Celsius, and where were these places, and how should we deal with them. And then this past year, you may have seen we did 5 pieces on emissions, which at first I thought, God, how boring can this be? But it actually turned out to be pretty darn interesting when you look at it. And I think one of the highlights was to crunching numbers and figuring out what, how big a difference there was in the emissions that a country had put into the atmosphere, which you can kind of get through satellite data, and how much they were reporting to the IPCC that they were emitting. And the difference was, you know, 20–25% on average, but, you know, some of them were incredible. And that sort of huge gap, you know, raises some questions about how how we go about measuring improvement, and how we go about measuring what's happening now. Forestry was an area where there was a lot of shenanigans going on, or I should say there are a lot of shenanigans going on. And so the whole thing turned out to be not too bad in the end. And I just wish we had had more time that year to do more in that along that theme, but we might do some more of that along that theme this year.
I'll just plug one story I feel like is undercovered as well, just which is oceans and fisheries. There's huge issues with illegal fishing, also legal fishing from very large countries. And there are obviously so many communities that depend on their local coastal resources, that there's huge conflicts there with overfishing, and climate is just a layer on top of that. And so I think that's a huge story in terms of everything from protecting local communities to migration, national security. You know, the fishery stuff touches almost everything. So.
No, that's great.
I would say there are a lot of investigative pieces to do in the environmental category, which doesn't always overlap with the climate category. But a large number of environmental justice stories, a lot of stories about plastics and, you know, industries and things like that, which I think are good investigative stories to do also.
Great, thank you all. We are just about time. I just want to ask one question that's come up a few times here, which is any advice for advocating for these kinds of stories in your newsroom? You know, we have obviously, you know, financial limitations, resource limitations are huge for a number of newsrooms, less so maybe than some of your own. There's, excuse me, a comment here from someone in Nigeria, for example, that, you know, they can't get the climate desk any focus on it. It's subsumed by other issues. Others are saying just the need for more quantity of good stories, right? If we're going to get people to pay attention, that it's got to be top of mind all the time. So any parting advice for if you want to cover this more in your newsroom? How do you advocate for this kind of coverage?
Show your editors what the other guys are doing. You know, journalists are paranoid sort of professionally, and editors are paranoid about you know, losing stories to other outlets. Look at newsrooms that are investing in reporting teams. Show, you know, document what competitors and other journalists you admire are doing, and take that with the facts of climate change itself. And, you know, one thing I just wanted to say, I know we got to wrap up, is as much as journalists are competitive, this is also, you know, say what you want about Twitter, it's made a lot of things extremely collaborative. You know, Twitter is you know, a system of micro professional communities where everyone on this call interacts now and then to compare notes, learn things, share things, and the social media, again, given aside from the fact that it's sort of destroying democracy, offers very important collaborative tools for where everybody can reach everybody else, and I hope we all continue to do so.
Great, thanks, Eric. Well, on that note, I thank everybody for joining us, Lauren, Steve, Eric, Yessenia, everybody out in the Zoom universe and Facebook universe. To learn more about our Global Crisis Reporting Forum, please go to our website, icfj.org. You can also subscribe to the newsletter, which will keep you up to date on upcoming events and resources. You can also check out our IJNet website, ijnet.org, which is in 8 languages, which provides a host of resources. And we will also, a lot of the things that are Eric and others talked about in terms of resources, we'll make sure that they get up there as well. Last thing, so I think that is everything. So thank you so much again, everybody, for joining us. We had people from Nigeria to the Hudson Valley. So we had a great group. So thank you all again. Thanks for joining us, and have a great morning, day, evening, night. Thanks, everybody.